first time I saw this movie, it was in the 1980s, and I was just a little bit of a wee lad, and Ronald Reagan was president, and it was all about, you know, the macho men and their big guns and their big knives. And I assumed it naturally because, you know, Paul Hogan apparently had some kind of humongously big knife, that this was going to be a cool adventure, cool action movie or something like that. But it turns out it wasn't. Now, the fact was that I was just a kid back then, and I was, you know, completely wrong about the entirety of this movie. But nevertheless, when I watched this movie, I just thought it was so boring. And I actually asked my friend that I watched it with, is anything gonna happen in this movie? He said, I don't know, let's just keep watching. I thought it was so uninspiring, and it took me up until 3 weeks ago, I think it was, when I re-watched the movie for the first time since the late 1980s. That is a huge gap. And I actually think that, save for a few little small details, I have the exactly same opinion now as then when it comes to this movie's qualities or lack thereof. Let's find out what those are, shall we? This is Crocodile Dundee. So a stuck-up journalist in some stuck-up New York magazine gets a call that there is a story going around about some, you know, frontier man in Australia who had his leg bitten off by a crocodile and crawled for 3 days before he reached civilization, or whatever they're calling this small little hamlet that he is residing in Australia. Apparently this story is big enough and cool enough for the newspaper to send her down to Australia, where she, you know, supposed to meet this guy. The guy she's supposed to meet is, of course, Crocodile Dundee, played by Paul Hogan, and basically the only cultural thing he did of significance during his entire, you know, life, essentially. I can't think about a single thing Paul Hogan has done outside of Crocodile Dundee. Thing is that the whole thing about the leg thing was a little bit over exaggerated, as, you know, these things tend to do. It was just a small love bite, and he takes her along, you know, out to the Australian outback, where they have some mildly unfunny and unadventurous things going on, where they scare off some hunters, and he saves her from a crocodile, which is not very dramatic at all as they shot it. And then all of a sudden she says, why don't you come to New York with me and meet my asshole fiance? And he says, okay. He is basically raised by Aborigines in the outback of Australia, and has never seen a big city before, and so this should be a big culture clash when he comes to New York. And, you know, this is the very, very early and very dingy and very unsavory version of New York, where they basically had knocked out San Salvador as the most dangerous capital on the planet. Still, however, New York seems to be like kind of this cool place. For the most part. But my question is, where is the laughter coming, and when is this movie gonna go freaking anywhere? Because you have no idea what not happens in this movie. What not happens in this movie is fucking everything. I don't know if that is a double negation or whatever it's called, but fucking nothing happens. There is a lot of people, he says. There is a TV, he says. The menu that they're eating from is in Italian, he says. Where is the comedy, I ask? Where is it? A fish out of water story can be really hilarious. It can be really, really inspiring. You know, he learns something from her, she learns something from him, they grow as people, and we're having some fun along with the whole thing. But when she's down in Australia, it's basically a big old travelodge for, look how great the outback looks. And when he is in New York, it is, look how fucking cool New York City looks, except, you know, the hookers and the pimps and the gangbangers and stuff like that. But we'll skip that for a second. The thing is that there is no real, you know, payoffs to the joke. There is almost a setup, but there is no follow through in it. And this is a very, very boring movie. it is a chore to get through this one, and even though this movie is rather short, I think it is 96 minutes long or something like that, it still felt that it's still going on to this day. It just won't fucking quit, and it won't find a purpose to exist through its entire existence. You know, movies should at least have a reason to exist. This one barely doesn't. There are these small little moments, these small little jokes that I think was kind of fun, and you know, you really believe Paul Hogan as Crocodile Dundee. And let's face it, when I was a kid and saw the "that is not a knife, this is a knife" and you know, sequence, the thing is that I thought it was the most awesome sequence I'd ever seen in my entire life back then. But I was like a 4th grader, maybe a 3rd grader or something like that. But when I rewatched it, as hokey as that scene is, I still feel that it works because it is so, you know, it is so awesome in its hokiness that I still go, ooh, that is so dumb, but I love it. I also love the fact that Carl Winslow, who plays, you know, his limo driver, actually takes the boomerang thing that they had on limousines back in the 1980s and used it as an actual factual boomerang. Why has that never happened in any movie before? It happened in fucking Crocodile Dundee. This movie is boring. If you're looking for an adventure movie, you ain't gonna get it. If you're looking for a romantic comedy, you ain't gonna get it. If you're looking for a fun fish out of water comedy, you ain't gonna fucking get that either. Sometimes older movies have a tendency of feeling very boring, very stretched out. In short, they can feel really, really dull and uninteresting. And in some cases, this doesn't matter too much because you still enjoy the movie. In some other cases like this one, it just makes the movie feel even longer and even more annoyingly boring. And I have, in few cases, want a movie to end more than I wanted fucking Crocodile Dundee to do, but it never did. It just kept going and going and going, and absolutely nothing happened that I thought was funny. It should also be mentioned that this movie has an infinitely better sequel, Crocodile Dundee 2, which mostly takes place in Australia, which is actually more of an action-adventure type of a survivalistic movie, which is far more fun, far more interesting, and far more entertaining than this piece of shit is. So do not see this movie. I have no idea how this movie became a huge hit. I have no idea how this movie became a huge hit in the early 1980s. But I will say that if you're curious about, you know, odd movies from the 1980s, do not see this movie. But do figure actually giving the sequel a watch, because not being a great movie, it is so much better than this one. I like the atmosphere of this movie, and it has some charm to it, I'll give it that. There are a few small little jokes here, there, and you know, once in a blue moon that actually works. But the rest of the movie is dreadfully boring. I give this movie 23 points. It is a chore to get through, and I never want to rewatch this movie ever again. So I'll see you next time from, well, so-and-so reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching, thank you very much.